4th New York History Program. I'm Dottie Rosenberg. I'm Vice President of the County Historical Society. We really would like to thank the Geneseo Valley Council on the Arts for its financial efforts in the restoration of the Welsh flag. And you will be hearing much more about the Welsh flag in a bit. We'd also like to thank Norm Culbertson, who carved the Civil War figures that are sitting right over on the display case. Norm, why don't you raise your hand or stand up or something so people can right here. We also would like especially to thank the Welsh family members who are here. Would you let us know where you are? Telling you about the flag.
With me, in a dedication part, when so many hands went up, I was going to ask all of the Welsh family members to come forward. But perhaps if you could be thinking of all the representatives who wish to send forward. Thank you.
And we'd also like to thank Ben Marinac. How did I pronounce it?
104th New York as well. And Jason, what do you represent with your 126? So we have quite a nice cross section here for you. The first slide that I put up, I thought would be a nice way to just kind of introduce us to the uniforms, because you traditionally think of the blue, of course, for the Union, for the North, for the Federals, okay, or the Yankees. And you usually think of the gray and, perhaps butternut or brownish color when you think of a Confederate or a Southerner or perhaps a rebel. But yet I found this picture in looking through Charles Barber's book of two Union officers. On the left here we have Lieutenant Albert Lamson of Company A of the 104th New York from Nunday. And then we have Captain Edward Sill, Company A of the 136th New York. And you see their war record right over here in the corner where the Welsh flag used to hang for the last few years. And yet you look at these guys, and I apologize for the slight bluish look here. We've knocked our back cord here, and it's given it a slightly bluish look. I guess that's perhaps Sergeant Welch's way of making his appearance here with us today. Thank you. I apologize for that bluish look to it. But yet, look at these guys. The holes in their pants. Their pants would have been all wool pants. They would have been very durable, even though they do have holes in them. They would have been good for. They would have been good for going through briars or prickers, something like that. The jacket, typical jacket for a Union soldier, would have been a 4-button sack coat, basically like a potato sack, no style to it at all. One large button that would come across, or a pocket that's on the inside, all made of wool. Again, made of wool not because cotton was in the South and it was hard to get a hold of cotton. Our shirts were mostly cotton, although some were flannel and wool. Largely because wool would last so long. In the Civil War, there were no winter uniforms, there were no summer uniforms. So it's the same uniform you're going to wear in the summertime, it's the same uniform you're going to wear in the wintertime. In the winter, you might have what's called a great coat. It's a very large coat that would hang over. Nobody brought one? No, that's not a great coat. Oh yeah, right up here. That would hang over and actually have a hood that could come up and over the soldier's head. And when you look at some of our Confederates here today, if you look closely at their equipment even, you may notice that it is United States in origin. And of course, that's because the greatest supplier to both armies, North and South, was of course the Northern Army. Okay, so I just thought that slide got us off and running. And we're going to be hearing today a brief history of the 104th and what I call a haversack chat. A haversack is one of the soldier's equipment. It's where he carries his personal items. And of course, our main reason here today is to rededicate the 104th New York Welsh flag. Okay? And again, my name is Joe DeBell. Formation of the Wadsworth Guards. In October of 1861, you would have seen signs very much like this one hanging right here. That would have been advertising something like, war, 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 come one, come all, and enlist in a first-class company. And indeed, men from all over Livingston County did. And they were recruited and they rendezvoused here in Geneseo under Colonel Rohrbach. And his picture is right up here, this gentleman just above the recruitment sign. They called themselves the Wadsworth Guards. And of course, General James Wadsworth is just over here, the second picture in. Wadsworth was never in command of the 104th. His relationship with the 104th was in terms of recruitment. And in researching for this, I actually found out he had not as big a role in recruitment as I originally thought. It actually was his wife who played a very instrumental role in recruiting men. Of course, he would have been a very popular man in this area. The Wadsworth Guards were in the 1st Brigade, 2nd Division, and the 1st Corps. Their pay was $13 a month. $13. By the end of the war, they got an increase in pay of $23 per month. They were paid a $100 bounty at the close of the war or upon a honorable discharge. Okay? Volunteers either came here in Geneseo to Camp Union. If you're not sure where Camp Union is, the village of Geneseo is kind of like a big square, okay? And they would be up at the corner of North Street and Highland, right? North and Highland. Right at the corner, and there is a historical marker there. In February, they were there then from October until February. During that time, the men would have been trained. There would have been drilling, of course. They would have been issued their equipment, okay? And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. In February of 1862, they took a train to Albany. Go. Of course, before they could do that, they had to swear an oath. And Dottie asked me, should we start with the Pledge of Allegiance? And I said, instead, why don't we start with the oath? So if you would like to raise your right hand and say the oath with me, feel free to do so. Do you solemnly swear that you will bear true allegiance to the United States of America, that you will serve them honestly and faithfully against all their enemies or opposers whatsoever, and that you will observe and obey the orders of the President of the United States and of the officers appointed over you according to the rules of the government of the armies. So help you God. And of course, you would reply by saying, yes, I do, and you were a soldier. Here's a Civil War picture of Colonel Rohrbach, okay? All right, the 104th New York had several companies. Company A was from Nunday, B was from Springwater, C was Centerville, Eagle, and Pike. Company D was Geneseo. Company E was Groveland and Cohocton and Burns. Company F was from the city of Rochester. Fowlerville, Alabama, and Gainesville was Company G. Company H and Company I were from Troy, and Troy and Cohoes was Company K. Now I put the picture of the chaplain in because we're having our chaplain who's going to talk a little later about flag restoration for us, and then at the end of our ceremony, after the Welch family has had a chance to speak, and we have done our unveiling, those of you who wish can come outside and we will fire a salute, and our chaplain will be saying a few words in memory of the soldiers of the 104th New York. This was Chaplain Daniel Russell, who was the chaplain of the 104th New York during the Civil War. All right. So the beginning part of 1862, the men are in Albany. They're in a place called Camp Rathbone. And in Albany, in Camp Rathbone, they most certainly would have learned the words to a very patriotic song, which I'm hoping we'll be able to hear at this point, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Do we have enough room to do that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So our musicians here will play us a rendition of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In March, they moved to a place called Camp Wadsworth, which was outside of Washington, D.C., where they were assigned to General Duray's brigade. They comprised themselves of the 97th New York, 104th, 105th, the 88th Pennsylvania, and the 107th Pennsylvania. And they were assigned to the 3rd Corps, the Army of Virginia, which, of course, would have been General McDowell. In April 1862, they moved to Camp Reliance, which was outside of Alexandria, Virginia. And they were there for 3 weeks of drill and disciplining. And I can just only imagine what Civil War disciplining was like for those 3 weeks. Of course, the Army of the Potomac was an extremely well-trained army. They were a volunteer army, so it really was, I think, a very important part. Their first assignment then, they were sent by railroad to the front on May 11th of 1862. So the war has been going on for roughly a year before they're involved, and they get a very difficult task. Their first task was sent into the valley to try to intercept or indeed trap Stonewall Jackson, which would not have been a very easy thing to have done, and indeed they were not successful at that. Stonewall Jackson, of course, would have been in command of the Confederates that you see here today. The 21st Georgia was part of Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry, okay, the famous foot cavalry in the Shenandoah Valley. And so I find it interesting that I reenact Confederate as a 21st Georgian and Union as a 104th New Yorker, and so I get to fight against myself in more than one occasion, apparently. I thought it was fitting then, at this point, if we could play a typical Confederate song for you, which would have been Stonewall Jackson's Way. So our musicians will perform again. August, then they were ordered back to Warrenton, Virginia, where they were then assigned to General Ricketts, where they would then be with General Ricketts until after the Battle of Antietam. When that happened, of course, then General Ricketts and General Banks formed a junction. So this is where they kind of transfer into what we would consider the Army of the Potomac. During that time, they certainly would have had to go visit their quartermaster. Quartermaster for the 104th was a fellow by the name of Henry Colt. That's where they would have gotten their equipment. So they've got their uniform and so on. They, of course, have their muskets. My musket at the moment is leaning behind these folks right here. If somebody can hand that out, I would appreciate it. It's very heavy. Watch your head. Some of the other soldiers, you might be able to take a look at theirs as well. The typical musket for a Civil War soldier was a 3-band Enfield early in the war. Later in the war, it would have been a U.S. Springfield, which was a much more highly accurate and better weapon. The Enfield was 58 caliber, so it was an extremely powerful weapon. It could kill at 300 yards. It could easily wound at 1,000 yards. This is part of the reason why the Civil War had such terrible toll in life and in wound, was the weaponry was extremely advanced. However, the tactics, if you take a look at our miniature display at the end of our session and talk to our reenactors who are authorities on that, you'll really find out how their tactics were quite outdated, especially for the weaponry that they had. When we go outside and fire our salute, I encourage you to take notice of how we load and fire, and at the end, feel free to talk to any of the reenactors about the procedures for loading and firing, and we'll be happy to share that with you. The soldiers also, I mentioned, would have had a haversack. Haversack was like just a small leather pouch or canvas pouch or tarred leather that they wore around them, where they kept any of their personal items, letters from home, food, plate, you name it, pictures of loved ones. They would, of course, have their canteen around their neck. They would have had a cartridge box. Now, a soldier from the 104th New York most undoubtedly would have had a cartridge box plate on there. Mine has SNY for the state of New York. Okay? This private has a US one. All right? They would have had a belt. On their belt would have been their cap pouch. Their cap pouch is where the small percussion cap is kept for discharging the weapon. Of course, in the cartridge box is where their ammunition and so on would be kept. Then, of course, they would have had what is called the frog and the scabbard, and, of course, the bayonet. And the bayonet, of course, would fix onto the end of the musket, and then, of course, it's off at an angle so the soldier could still fire his weapon while having the bayonet on the end. And the bayonet, of course, would be used for hand-to-hand combat, which all the soldiers would have been trained in. So any of this type of equipment, the soldiers would have had to go see the quartermaster to get that type of equipment. All right, 1862, the soldiers of the 104th finally become engaged. Now, their first battle was not Antietam, but Antietam was where they really were, really hit hard. So I'm going to talk about that first. The Maryland campaign, the South's first real invasion into the North, took place in September of 1862. Of course, the Battle of Antietam was September 17th of 1862. This coming September will be, of course, the 140th anniversary of that. And as a reenactor and an American, I'm certainly aghast with what happened on September 11th of 2001, where we lost 3,000 countrymen. Keep in mind that at the Battle of Antietam, where we'll be celebrating the 140th anniversary of that, we lost 23,000 in one day. 23,000. And indeed, September 11th, 2001 was the costliest day in American history since September 17th of 1862. So the 104th was very much engaged that day. They were part of General Hooker's First Corps. They attacked across the cornfield at dawn. And of course, they attacked Stonewall Jackson. So again, here's the 104th New York attacking the 21st Georgia near the Dunkirk Church. They drove the Confederates away from their position. However, the Confederates were quickly reinforced by John Bell Hood's Texans and the 104th and the 1st Corps had to fall back. In just a few minutes, the regiment lost almost 100 men. That was a very costly few minutes. There was a monument there near the Dunkard Church, and I have a picture of it I'll show you in a moment, that marks the spot the furthest of their advance on the Antietam battlefield. But back about a month before that, they actually were involved in the Battle of Cedar Mountain. That was their baptism of fire. They were lucky to have no losses at that battle. Of course, they were involved at the end of August in Second Bull Run. Students who are from my class visiting today, if you're coming with me, of course, in about 3 weeks on our trip, we'll be going to the battlefield of Second Bull Run. Now, the kids in the other schools are saying, firemen and that guy's They were on the left end of the battlefield. They were in support of Thompson's battery, and they carried their position. The Confederates carried their position around 5 in the afternoon, where they had a retreat. They had 37 killed and 100 missing at that battle. In about 27 days, starting from the beginning of August until near the end of September, they were involved in 5 battles and did not have a full night's sleep. And they had only 200 men left out of 1,000. So here's an excellent example of what happened to, indeed, a great many companies, North and South, in the Civil War. They very quickly were decimated, and not many of them were left. Here's a picture of that monument on the Antietam battlefield. In late 1862, they finally crossed the Potomac, and of course they were in Antietam. McClellan had kept them there for a good month and a half. They eventually crossed at the end of October back from Maryland and into Virginia. They were now under the command of General Gibbon, and Colonel Root was their colonel now, and they were the 1st Brigade, 94th New York, and the 104th, 107th, and the 16th Maine. In December of 1862, they floated across some pontoon bridges in front of Fredericksburg and were under Franklin's command. The following day, there were plans made for an attack by Franklin, of course, to the Heights, Marie's Heights, outside of Fredericksburg, and of course, they attack at none other than Stonewall Jackson once again. They were involved in some spirit attacks led by later Army of the Potomac Commander General Meade and, of course, General Gibbon, and they are thrown back. The 104th New York had 10 men wounded, 50 killed, and 200 taken prisoner. Here's the picture of the battlefield of Fredericksburg. These pontoon bridges down here in the lower corner would have been where the 104th crossed, and they would have attacked on Jackson's right, and they would have been on the left end of the Union Army. Being on the flank of either army is a sign of your battle hardness and your trust by your commander. So I find it very fitting that the 104th was put in such a position. It speaks a lot to me. In 1863, they were in winter quarters, of course, from December until April, early in the war. They pretty much took the winters off. Even late in the war, they were at Petersburg for a long time. They were part of Burnside's Mud March. They were involved at the Battle of Chancellorsville, as we'll see. And, of course, tying in with the Welsh family here, the Battle of Gettysburg, which we'll look at in a few minutes. And late in the year, they were involved in some operations. Chancellorsville, Hooker is now in command of the Union Army. The plan is, of course, to swing around behind Lee. They would have crossed at Ely's Ford 2 days after the army is actually engaged. The army had started fighting, then the 104th was sent. They, oddly enough, went by moonlight as skirmishers. Of course, this is the battle where Stonewall Jackson is going to be wounded by his own men at night. And they were ordered to make some breastworks. If we have any veterans of the real United States Army, the modern United States Army, I'm sure you'll appreciate the next few things that I put on here. They were ordered back and made breastworks, and then the next day they were ordered forward to right where they had been the day before. I can only imagine what those men were saying. And then they remained there that whole day and were involved in a skirmish where they actually held their own. Chancellorsville was not a highlight for the Union Army, but the 104th did very well and actually only had 3 men wounded. Again, they came in at the end of that battle. Here's a picture of their monument at Gettysburg, okay? And our drummer, Jason, is an alumni from Gettysburg College. And Jason, how many times have you run by that monument? Numerous times. And Jason and I have actually been to that monument together. If you ever get to go to the Gettysburg battlefield, again, my class will go, and I'll take you right to this monument. It's just below the first tower, over near the Peace. Yeah, over near the Peace Memorial. Okay. At Gettysburg, they were involved with Reynolds' First Corps, so they were the first onto the field. They engaged the enemy at Seminary Ridge. They were fighting against the brigades of Daniel and O'Neill. They took heavy losses. However, they did carry their position and take a stone wall under Colonel Pry's personal leadership. That's where the monument is marked. Now, Pry was put in command because General Hall was shot through the face. And the 2 colonels, senior colonels underneath General Hall were also wounded. So command immediately went down to Pry. Of course, this is where Sergeant Welch would have hid the colors, and according to Private Barber, he said also Sergeant Wallace also hid, I believe, the other set of colors, flank colors. If you ever get to go to Gettysburg, in the center of town, at the Gettysburg Hotel, there is a little historical marker there explaining the battle, and it is entitled "Skin of Our Teeth." And it's Colonel Pry, acting General Pry, saying that the 104th escaped through the town by the skin of their teeth. Of course, with the Confederates in hot pursuit that first day. They were lucky to take positions east of Cemetery Hill. When they got to Cemetery Hill, out of 330 men, they only had 3 officers and 43 men. The rest would have been straggling along or, of course, captured or wounded. So you can understand why, when that flag was hit, just what a life and death situation I think it really was. The next day, they had about 100 men. So, men would have been slowly arriving. They helped save an artillery position near a peach orchard near Ziegler's Grove up at Cemetery Hill. And then they were involved in Pickett's charge. They were behind the stone wall and engaged General Pettigrew of North Carolina. At Gettysburg, grand total, the 104th had 15 killed, and then 16 that were mortally wounded that died later, for a total of 31 killed. They had 78 wounded and 88 captured or missing. Here's a drawing of the Battle of Gettysburg. So they would have been north of the town. If you're familiar with the history of Gettysburg, the north arrived in the south of Gettysburg, and the south arrived from the north. And they would have come back through the town over here to Cemetery Hill. Right here is where Ziegler's Grove is, and where they defended the second day, and of course the third day at Pickett's charge. Of course, to get to Gettysburg, they would have marched there. So I thought it'd be fitting at this point if our musician's choice is some sort of marching song that perhaps either of the armies could have played and listened to. Apparently, right? So in the Civil War, they were willing to pay extra for entertainment as well. So musicians were paid extra. And indeed, Robert E. Lee said himself he could not imagine the Army without music. 1864, they're in winter camp for several months. They're then part of the 5th Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, and they're down to the 16th Maine, who they've been with for a while, and the 13th Massachusetts, and the 104th New York. You have to remember, each time a new commanding general takes over, just like when we have new politicians, one of the first things that happens is reorganization, right? Change is I guess, inevitable. In 1864, in May, they were involved at the Battle of Wilderness. They were held in reserve under General Hancock, but of course it was a very sad day for many of the men from the 104th, because that is where General Wadsworth was, of course, mortally wounded. So that would have been a very tough day. They were involved with General Grant and his overland campaign. General Grant here just to the right of the screen. So they were involved with the typical 40 days. They were then in Fort Warren in Petersburg, Virginia, for the siege of Petersburg. But it's August 18th, 1864. That was the very tough day for the 104th New York. What happened that day is something called the Weldon Railroad Battle, or the Battle of Globe Tavern. Of course, they were part of Warren's 5th Corps. The 3rd Division was under General Crawford. They struck that railroad. General Crawford had some mismanagement, as was common throughout the Civil War. And the 104th filled a gap between the 5th Corps and the 11th Corps. They're surrounded by General Heath of A.P. Hill's Corps from the Confederates. And every officer of the 104th New York was taken prisoner. Every officer. And indeed, most of the regiment. A few escaped and helped keep the regiment alive and going. They are then sent in September to Libby Prison, then sent to Salisbury, North Carolina, and then eventually to Danville, Virginia. And of course, they were moving them around so much because at that point things were not going well for the Confederacy. So they were trying to keep those prisoners as perhaps an exchange. The exchange did occur, but it was not until February of 1865. The remaining soldiers who were not captured at the Weldon Railroad, they were involved in a few minor skirmishes in February of 1865. Of course, the general exchange in February, and most of the men returned to Petersburg. They were present at Appomattox. Again, my class of kids will be going to Appomattox. We'll see this room where you see Generals Grant and General Lee accepting the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. But the 104th is not done with history even at that point. In April, Corporal Wheaton was present at Ford's Theater when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And in May, actually just this morning, I was looking through for my trip to see what happened in a book that a good friend of mine gave me for all of the years for that will be on our trip, my class trip, and I found that, in 1865 they were involved in the Grand Review of Troops in Washington, D.C., and that's on some of the days that we'll be out of town. In July of 1865, they're mustered out in Elmira, okay, where, of course, there was a prison camp of Southern soldiers, and indeed some of my 21st Georgian brethren are buried there. They organized originally in 1861 with 1,700 men. They only mustered out 350. Here's basically why. We have roughly about 140 people here. If we were to march off into a battle, on average, 2 of us would be killed. Okay? 2 out of that 140. On average, about 26 of us would get a disease. So obviously we have a much higher risk of catching some sort of disease. The most common disease in the Civil War, of course, was dysentery. We had about 20 of us that would have been wounded. So we had a much higher risk of being sick, getting ill, or getting wounded than we actually had of being killed. If that is any sort of comfort, I don't believe it is. But you can understand why then after 4 years, why so many of the men were gone. They had 4 reunions. Indeed, the last one in 1980 of the 104th around to see that day. I thought it was fitting on my last slide. I took a quote. Here's the man that I got a majority of my information from. This is a private, Charles Barber. He was in Company A of the 104th. This picture was taken in early 1862. This quote was taken from that last reunion in 1908. And it says, "Trampled and beaten were they as the sand, and unshaken as the continent. When I originally was asked to do this day by Mr. Parrish, he said, we want a private view of the war. And for me, many people always ask me, how did you get into reenacting? And I know the moment, and I know the reason. And it's this letter that, if you would give me the time, I'd like to read it to you. It is a letter written by a soldier from the 2nd Rhode Island. His name is Sullivan Ballou. And he was writing to his wife back in Rhode Island a week before the first Battle of Bull Run. July 14th, 1861, Camp Clark, Washington. We can turn the light on that. My dear Sarah, the indications are very strong that we will move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. Lest I should not be able to write you again, I feel compelled to write you a few lines that may fall under your eye when I will be no more. I have no misgivings or lack of confidence in the cause in which I engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization now leans on the triumph of the government, and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the Revolution. And I am perfectly willing to lay down all the joys of this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt. Sarah, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break. And yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind, and it bears me irresistible on with the chains to the battlefield. The memories of the blissful moments that I have spent with you come creeping over me, and I am most grateful to God and to you that I have enjoyed them for so long. And it is hard for me to give them up and burn to ashes the hopes of future years when, God willing, I might have lived and loved together with you and seen our sons grow up to honorable manhood. I know but few small claims upon divine providence, but something whispers to me, Sarah. Perhaps it is the wafted prayer of my little Edgar, that I shall return to my loved ones unharmed. But if I do not, Sarah, never forget how much I love you. And when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name. Forgive my faults and my pains that I have caused you, how thoughtless and how foolish I have been at times, how gladly I would wash them out with my tears, every little spot upon your happiness. But Sarah, the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they love, I shall always be with you. In the gladdest days and the darkest nights. Always. Always. And when there is a soft breeze upon your cheek, it will be my breath. And if the cool air fans your temple, it shall be my spirit passing by. Sarah, do not mourn me dead. Think that I am gone, and wait for thee, for we will meet again. Sullivan Ballou was then killed a week later at the first Battle of Bull Run. I appreciate your attention, and at this point I'd like to turn it over to our chaplain, who will come up and talk to us a little bit about...
Sitting in for President Alberta, Dunn of the Historical Society, and I'll put aside my 2 pages and just be very brief with the dedication as part of it. I would suggest, though, that as we dedicate this flag, that we think about all of the common soldiers, as Private DeBell has mentioned, those who went out from our small communities. We look at the generals and their forces, and of course they were important men too. But I suggest we think today, as you drive out of town, if you're from away, as you drive by Camp Union at the head of Highland and North Street, that these were common, ordinary, hard-working young men who went out of here. Our last speaker mentioned the Thompson brothers. And the Thompson brothers have a fascinating diary that they left, and how their family came up, brought them chicken Sundays to Camp Union. Now, the girlfriends came and they talked. How things were quiet in Geneseo, so they go to church 2 or 3 times a day on Sunday. Then we know, we've heard the history that goes along with it. So, as we do our unveiling, let us give thanks and thoughts for all of the boys who went out not expecting anything that they were to find like the reality of the camp. This time, I'd like to call the representatives of the Welsh family forward around the flag.
You can come up, please.
Yeah, you're all welcome to come.
I'd say at least half dozen, perhaps.
I think they're around the flag. Get some photos.
Yes.
As a family is arranging.
We're Welsh, we didn't say we were smart.
Would you introduce yourself?
I'm Ellen Perry. This is my great-grandfather.
I'm Howard Welch, and this is my great-grandfather.
Clarence Welch, and that was my great-grandfather.
I'm Jim Welch, and they're all my cousins. Could I say one thing?
You can say anything you'd like.
It's too warm, and I don't want to say a lot because you'll forget about it around. But in addition to doing the historical part of this, I also have been working on a family tree. I'm not going to embarrass Lee. The other day I happened to think, you know something? There's one individual in this town who's supposed to be relative, a direct descendant of John, and also the Logic family. That's Lee Gilbert's son.
Is that right?
I called Sarah, his mother, and she called her mother, Martha, and Martha said, unfortunately, we were from the other branch, not James, but James's father would have been your great-great-great-great-grandmother, right? Wait. So please stand up.
I'm sorry,
thank you
Mr.
for that.
Welch. Oh, you're welcome.
Jim, I don't
Jim.
go like
On one postscript, he mentioned the Wadsworth family, and after the Civil War, Lockwood L. Doty was invited to go to Albany and to accumulate all of the Civil War records. And in the back room, we have the military records of the Civil War, and Lockwood L. Doty got into the Wadsworth family too somehow. But that was right in this room, of course. If we could all stand for the dedication, rededication.
Is there any soldiers, if they could shoulder arms? Present. Oh!
Familiar words. On November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln stood before several thousand drenched listeners at the new Gettysburg Cemetery. We all know the words. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor powers to aid or detract. It is rather for us, the living, to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that we may here highly resolve that these dead who have not died in vain, that this nation under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Perhaps these words could not be known by Sergeant John P. Welsh and the hellacious 3 days of Gettysburg, but I suggest that in his heart he believed the words that President Abraham Lincoln was to give at Gettysburg. We, you would, please. We rededicate the Sergeant Welsh flag in the name of our proud historic heritage, and most importantly, in the name of union and freedom. Our flag.
At this point, folks, we would like to step outside if you're willing, and the soldiers will fire a official salute.